Welcome, everybody, to the Wilmette Institute's dialogue webinar on global challenges and opportunities. In this series, we highlight not just the threats and dangers that humanity faces, but the potential solutions as well. In the coming weeks, we will examine such challenges as the coronavirus pandemic. We've already examined it a few times. Climate change, which is the topic tonight. Dysfunction at the international level, that's sort of also part of the topic tonight, you might say. Racism, gender inequality, the extremes of wealth and poverty. In short, all the various messages that the Universal House of Justice, the supreme governing body of the Baha'i Faith, mentioned in its 1986 statement, The Promise of World Peace. The goal of this series will always be to explore the opportunities to solve and mitigate the challenges. Tonight, we will hear the fourth presentation by Christine Muller in her series on the issue of climate change. The title tonight is How Can Spiritual Principles Save the Climate? By the way, next week, the title will be Hope in the Face of Dire Scientific Projections. So there will be a positive ending to this series next week. Christine Muller joined the Wilmette Institute as support faculty for its Sustainable Development course in 2011, and then she helped to create the Climate Change course the following year. She has served on the board of the Rhode Island Interfaith Power&Light group for 9 years and currently serves on the board of the Baha'i-inspired International Environment Forum, which you can find at iefworld.org. Her academic background, however, is in music, and she enjoys part-time piano playing and playing music. And she will tell you that this training has been an important part in her ability to become a climate change activist as well in terms of the skills. The topic tonight, to give you a quick summary, the Baha'i teachings provide the spiritual foundation for humans to live in harmony with each other and with the earth. But how can we apply specific Baha'i teachings to climate change? Among the teachings that will be discussed are justice, truthfulness, the role of science and religion, gender equality, the elimination of extremes of wealth and poverty, moderation, the oneness of humanity, and the spiritual development. This dialogue series, remember, is also broadcast live over Facebook and our YouTube channel, and it's recorded and will be available later over our YouTube channel. We invite you to invite your friends and neighbors to tune in as well. They're generally designed for a broad audience, and so we hope that many people will benefit from this Global Challenges and Opportunities series. Without further delay, I now turn to Christine and invite her to give her presentation for tonight. Christine, welcome, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much, Robert. And welcome to everyone to our fourth conversation on climate change. In the past conversations, we talked about the impacts of climate change on nature and about the suffering these impacts have already brought to people throughout the world. We talked about the causes of global warming and how it is changing the climate, and about the numerous practical and technical measures we can and must take to address the problem. All this knowledge is a prerequisite for any meaningful action, but by far not sufficient. Today we focus on spiritual and ethical principles. The Baha'i Faith teaches that throughout human history, the Creator of the universe has provided teachings that guide humans in their relationship with each other and with nature, by sending us prophets such as Abraham, Krishna, Buddha, Moses, Christ, and Mohammed. Today, humankind is threatened by many serious social and environmental problems, climate change being one of the most dangerous. Would we not expect further divine guidance for our age at a time when the very survival of humanity is at stake? Baha'is believe that God did indeed send us a new prophet. Baha'u'llah was born in 1817 at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. He lived in Iran until the government banished him from his native country. His long exile brought him to Baghdad, Istanbul, and as a final destination to the prison city of Akko in the Holy Land. At that time, all these places were still untouched by the industrialization going on in Europe. Baha'u'llah wrote, "Each one of the ordinances we have revealed is a mighty stronghold for the preservation of the world of being." Each one of the ordinances we have revealed is a mighty stronghold for the preservation of the world of being. These are powerful and hopeful words. We need hope at a time when scientists and many people who are fully aware of humanity's situation are in despair and have lost hope for the future of humankind. Those of you who are Baha'is may scratch your head now and think, how can we apply each of the teachings of Baha'u'llah in our efforts to mitigate climate change? And those of you who don't know much about the Bahá'í Faith may wonder what these teachings might be that hold such exciting promise to be a mighty stronghold for the preservation of the world of being. These are among the most important Bahá'í teachings. I will now share some thoughts about how we can apply some of these spiritual teachings to the climate crisis. The topics covered in my presentation are shown here in red. I hope that in our conversation, you will bring up some other teachings. Obviously, we will not be able to talk about all of them this evening. Some of these teachings are also part of other religions. That's not surprising, because they all come from the same source. Let us first look at human relationship with nature. Stewardship of the earth is one of the teachings which you can find in all religions. Jewish scriptures say, when God created the first human beings, God led them around all the trees of the Garden of Eden and said, "See my works, how beautiful and praiseworthy they are. Think of this, and do not corrupt or destroy my world." The Islamic Declaration of Climate Change summarizes the teachings of Mohammed and applies them to our age. God created the earth in perfect equilibrium. The present climate change catastrophe is a result of the human disruption of this balance. Baha'u'llah explains, nature is God's will and is its expression in and through the contingent world. If nature is God's will, it is God's creation and we should not destroy it. All human beings, plants and animals are God's creation and will. Stephen Edmund, the Swedish delegate to the World Council of Churches, said, "Religions can help us recapture a sense of the sacredness of creation, for nature mirrors the beauty and love of God." A closely related aspect is human interconnectedness with nature. In the past decades, we have acted based on the illusion that we humans are separate and independent from nature. Now we need to realize that we are part of the web of life and cannot control nature or each other through violence. We are all connected to each other and to all living beings. Most of our actions have a direct or indirect impact on other people, on plants, animals, and the climate. We have seriously degraded this web of life and disrupted the balance in the Earth's natural systems. The Baha'i teachings explain, reflect upon the inner realities of the universe. Every part of the universe is connected with every other part by ties that are very powerful and admit of no imbalance, nor any slackening whatever. Human actions are destroying this balance in nature with serious consequences, not only for plants and animals, but for human life. A deep insight into the interconnectedness of all life is fundamentally important when tackling the complex problem of climate change. This brings us to a new concept in religious history. The Bahá'í Faith teaches that we need to rely on both science and religion, and that these two must be in harmony. Science and religion are tools to investigate reality from two different angles. Science asks, how does the universe work? Religion asks, why is there a universe? And what is its purpose? And what is our purpose of existence as human beings? How can we apply this to climate change? Science can explain the causes of global warming and can project with various amounts of certainty the impacts of the resulting changes in climate. Science and technology can also provide some technical solutions. Then, however, it is up to the public and to politicians to consider scientific facts, to apply values, and then to act accordingly. The values come from religion. Closely connected to this topic is truthfulness, which, according to the Baha'i teachings, is the foundation of all human virtues. Why is truthfulness so significant when we talk about climate change? You may know only too well that in a few countries, some people have deliberately shed doubt on climate science, either driven by vested interests or by ideology. As intended, this has confused the public and has seriously delayed effective climate action. We have seen a similar phenomenon with the coronavirus. In those countries where the threat was initially belittled or where scientific advice was ignored, many more people got sick and died from COVID-19 infection. The suffering and death caused by inaction on climate change, of course, are and will be on a much larger scale than with COVID-19. However, it is more difficult for people to connect the causes with the effects of climate change because the effects are often experienced as remote, both in time and geography. Climate change is not merely an environmental problem. It is very much a human problem, a social issue. The poor of the world are generally first and most severely affected by climate change, such as farmers in Africa or people in Bangladesh who are threatened by sea level rise. Just a few weeks ago, the lives of 3 million Bangladeshis were devastated by Cyclone Amphan, and much agricultural land has become useless because of saltwater flooding. In general, one can say that those most vulnerable to climate change are often least able to afford adaptation measures, such as dikes, irrigation to compensate for droughts, or moving away from flood or storm-prone areas. Even in the developed countries are the poor first at risk from the impacts of climate change. The executive director of Oxfam International said, "Climate change is the central poverty issue of our times. Climate change is happening today, and the world's poorest people, who already face a daily struggle to survive, are being hit hardest." Poverty alleviation is a central teaching in all religions. The Bible teaches, "Verily I say unto you, Inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these my brethren, ye have done it unto me. And Baha'u'llah wrote, O ye rich ones on earth, the poor in your midst are my trust. Guard ye my trust, and be not intent only on your own ease. In the Bahá'í Faith, there is an added dimension to that. Baha'u'llah calls for the eradication of the extremes of both poverty and wealth. Eliminating the extremes of wealth is important for climate change mitigation, because the rich people of the world are the ones who are responsible for most of the carbon pollution in our atmosphere. This graph shows the annual emissions of top emitters. You can see how China's emissions have grown tremendously in recent decades. However, this issue is quite complex. When we look at emissions per capita, the picture is quite different. You can see how much more CO2 the average American is emitting compared to other people. You can also see that emissions in the US and the European Union have been declining. However, this issue is even more complex. The mining of resources and the production of goods have increasingly been taking place in developing nations. On this slide, you can see the major flows from the areas of production to the countries of consumption. So while China's emissions have been growing rapidly, the consumption of the West is partly to blame for that increase. We also need to be aware that there is a small number of extremely rich people all over the world who are consuming much of the world's resources and cause more than their fair share of emissions. Here you can see the disparity of poverty and wealth illustrated. More than 2/3 of the world's people own together only 3% of the wealth. The top 8.5% of the world owns 83%. Wealth is a major cause of global warming because of the huge consumption of the rich. That's one reason why the eradication of the extremes of both poverty and wealth is so important. Hokukola is a major tool to implement this teaching. Hokukola translates as the right of God. It is a spiritual law consisting of the payment of a prescribed portion of one's income after the deduction of necessary expenses. It also helps us to reflect on our life. Which of our expenses are necessary and which are luxury? This spiritual exercise can also affect our future consumption, which will have another positive impact on the climate. The money from Hokukola is used for global well-being. In addition, the Baha'i teachings call for progressive taxes and encourage voluntary charitable giving. Since poor people suffer first and the most from climate change impacts, and since the activities of the rich people are responsible for the warming of the earth, climate change is foremost an issue of justice. Another aspect of justice is the responsibility for reducing emissions. On this slide, you can see the historical CO2 emissions from different countries. These emissions raised the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere for a long time. Historically, the European Union and the United States certainly bear most responsibility. Therefore, this is also an issue of justice between developed and developing nations. By far the greatest justice issue is the fate of our children, grandchildren, and generations to come. What kind of a planet are we leaving to them? This is called intergenerational justice, justice between generations. Young people all over the world are beginning to understand how much their future is in danger because of climate change, and they are speaking out. It is imperative to uphold justice in all political and economic decisions. Baha'u'llah said, "No light can compare with the light of justice. The establishment of order in the world and the tranquility of the nations depend upon it." And Abdul Baha wrote, "We ask God to endow human souls with justice, so that they may be fair and may strive to provide for the comfort of all, that each member of humanity may pass his life in the utmost comfort and welfare." It is extremely relevant to our topic that Baha'u'llah directly connects justice to moderation. Whoso cleaveth to justice can, under no circumstances, transgress the limits of moderation. The civilization, so often wanted by the learned exponents of arts and sciences, will, if allowed to overleap the bounds of moderation, bring great evil upon men. If carried to excess, civilization will prove as prolific a source of evil as it had been of goodness when kept within the restraints of moderation. It is impossible to have perpetual economic growth in a finite biosphere. We need to learn to accept the limits of our planet. In the past, it was justified to consider a growing economy as desirable progress. And this still holds true for many poor people and countries of the world. However, for the rich countries and for the planet as a whole, we have reached the limits of growth. In fact, we have already surpassed them. The current capitalistic economy exploits the earth and destroys its life support systems. It also exploits many people and exacerbates the extremes of wealth and poverty. The baseline for a sustainable economy should be the carrying capacity of the earth. In other words, we cannot continue to produce more and more stuff. However, many people are not connected to a higher purpose in life and therefore fill their inner emptiness with material things. This materialism results in excessive consumption. Millions of people are trying to find meaning in their lives by shopping and owning. One scholar even called consumerism the first global religion. However, several scientific studies indicate that once basic needs are met, human beings don't increase their life satisfaction or happiness by accumulating greater wealth. On a finite planet, it is no longer possible to satisfy everybody's wants. The goal should be to provide for the needs of all people and to improve the quality of life for everyone. Gandhi said, "The earth provides enough to satisfy every man's needs, but not every man's greed." That's why the teachings about moderation and the spiritual meaning of life can help us overcome our destructive addiction to stuff. The Universal House of Justice wrote, "At all times, contentment and moderation, benevolence and fellow feeling, sacrifice and reliance on the Almighty are qualities that befit the God-fearing soul. The forces of materialism promote a quite contrary line of thinking, that happiness comes from constant acquisition, that the more one has, the better, that worry for the environment is for another day." Spirituality is the remedy for materialism and consumerism. A spiritual outlook can help us shift the emphasis from consumption to well-being and a meaningful life. Abdu'l-Baha said, "Man is in reality a spiritual being, and only when he lives in the spirit is he truly happy." Baha'u'llah calls us to live a life of contentment. Take from this world only to the measure of your needs, and forego that which exceedeth them. And in the next sentence, he connects contentment again with justice. Observe equity in all your judgments, and transgress not the bounds of justice, nor be of them that stray from its path. Justice, moderation, and contentment are not abstract concepts. They need to be applied in daily action. The Universal House of Justice wrote, "Every choice a Baha'i makes, as employee or employer, producer or consumer, borrower or lender, benefactor or beneficiary, leaves a trace, and the moral duty to lead a coherent life demands that one's economic decisions be in accordance with lofty ideals, that the purity of one's aims be matched by the purity of one's actions to fulfill those aims." Another important Baha'i teaching is trustworthiness. You may wonder about the relationship of trustworthiness and climate change. Actually, there is a lot. We can blame corruption for much environmental destruction. Illegal logging, for example, is a major cause of deforestation. Another example are companies that ignore environmental regulations just to increase their profit. In addition, illegal logging, poaching, and illegal unsustainable fishing also rob communities of natural resources and therefore undermine their sustainable socio-economic development. Trustworthiness is the antidote for corruption and is strongly emphasized by Baha'u'llah. Trustworthiness is the greatest portal leading onto the tranquility and security of the people. In truth, the stability of every affair has depended and does depend upon it. All the domains of power, of grandeur, and of wealth are illumined by its light. Trustworthiness is in truth the best of vestures for your temples and the most glorious crown for your heads. The central Baha'i teaching is the oneness of humankind, that all human beings are equal, that there is only one race, the human race, and that this is the age in which we must learn to live together like one family. Several other teachings are connected to that overall theme. Most important is the abandonment of all prejudices. Recognition of this truth requires abandonment of prejudice. Prejudice of every kind: race, class, color, creed, nation, sex, degree of material civilization, everything which enables people to consider themselves superior to others. Racism plays a role at the beginning and at the end of the climate change problem. First, people of color are more likely to live in a neighborhood close to a coal-fired power plant, an industrial complex that releases toxic chemicals, a landfill, or even a hazardous waste facility. The air they breathe and the water they drink are more likely polluted than in a predominantly white suburb. That is certainly one of several reasons why proportionally more African Americans and Latinos have died from COVID-19. At the same time, this air pollution contributes to global warming. Then, of course, people of color are also more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, such as heat waves in their polluted neighborhood, storms, and rising food prices. And on top of all that, the voice of people of color is often not represented in decision-making because of discriminatory practices, including in voting. The equality of men and women is another new teaching in the religious history, and it is significant in regard to climate change in many ways. First, we need to consider that women are disproportionately more affected by the impacts of climate change. They generally have less access to resources such as land, credit, decision-making bodies, agricultural inputs, technology, and educational services that could help them cope with a changing climate. As caregivers, their lives are also severely impacted by increasing water scarcity and diseases like malaria that are spreading to new areas because of climate change. The empowerment of women is not only a human rights issue, but also a key element to fight poverty and climate change. Experience has shown already that the participation of women in climate change mitigation and adaptation efforts is vital. Women have always been leaders in working for the health and well-being of their families and communities. The status of women also has a direct impact on population growth. Greenhouse gas emissions have only reached such a dangerously high level because of the large numbers of people living on our planet. Today, there are more than 7.7 billion people. In 2050, it is estimated that there may be 8 to 10.5 billion of us. Population growth is much smaller in countries where women have more rights. Family size is generally smaller when women are empowered to plan their family in terms of birth timing and spacing, and when they have the freedom to participate fully and equally in society. The principle of the oneness of humankind does not only uphold the equality of all human beings, it is also the ultimate goal to be realized. Baha'u'llah said, "Take pride not in love for yourselves, but in love for your fellow creatures. Glory not in love for your country, but in love for mankind." The deep belief in the oneness of humankind is essential to effectively address climate change in two ways. It helps us as individuals to understand that my everyday actions affect my brothers and sisters all around the world. This attitude will change the way we live and what we consume. Applying the principle of the oneness of mankind on the societal level is a prerequisite to address nationalism and is the foundation for global governance. And all of this is very important for effective climate action. The Universal House of Justice wrote, "The welfare of any segment of humanity is inextricably bound up with the welfare of the whole. Humanity's collective life suffers when any one group thinks of its own well-being in isolation from that of its neighbors, or pursues economic gain without regard for how the natural environment, which provides sustenance for all, is affected." Baha'u'llah said, "The well-being of mankind, its peace and security are unattainable unless and until its unity is firmly established. The Earth Charter clearly spells out the need for the unification of humankind. The choice is ours. Form a global partnership to care for Earth and one another, or risk the destruction of ourselves and the diversity of life. As we can see from the outcome of a series of international climate conferences, our global human family is paralyzed by nationalistic and short-term self-interest. It is unlikely that the required major transformation of society can be achieved within the existing systems of political and economic thinking. We need to make a transition from thinking in terms of nation states to world citizenship. Baha'u'llah said, "The earth is but one country and mankind its citizens." Embracing the concept of the oneness of humanity will change our perspective of climate mitigation efforts in many ways. For example, some people and governments in developed countries have argued that the costs for mitigating global warming are too high for their economy. They ignore the fact that the first severely harmful effects of climate change are happening primarily in other countries. Such reasoning will stop when we regard the world as just one country and humankind as one family. We equally value the lives of people in other countries who may often be poor or of a different race. Moreover, the environmental crisis demands that all of humanity work together to implement solutions. The Bahá'í international community wrote, "The solution to climate change exceeds the capacities and resources of any one nation and requires the full cooperation of all nations, each according to their means. Strong and enforceable laws need to be created to limit greenhouse gas emissions, not only on the local and national level, but also on the international level. There is a desperate need for global environmental governance. Pollution has no boundaries." Baha'u'llah called for the establishment of a world federation of nations with its own legislative, judicial, and executive bodies. Such a world order is not only new in that it encompasses all of humankind, but also new in the underlying philosophy. The first priority is the well-being of everyone on the planet. National, regional, and local interests are respected, but are considered in the light of humankind being one family. This new world order is very balanced. It also promotes decentralization and empowerment of people at the grassroots. All people need to have a voice in the decisions that will affect their lives. Minorities and women must be especially empowered to take part in all plans for sustainable development. The knowledge and experience of indigenous peoples is essential in that process. Indigenous people all over the world have been at the forefront of calling for climate action and for protecting forests and water. Development projects have proven to be much more beneficial if the knowledge and experience of the local population are incorporated. The Bahá'í international community wrote, "Top-down models of community development can no longer adequately respond to modern-day needs and aspirations. The world community must move toward more participatory, knowledge-based, and values-driven systems of governance in which people can assume responsibility for the processes and institutions that affect their lives." These systems need to be democratic in spirit and method, and must emerge on all levels of society, including the global level. Consultation, the operating expression of justice in human affairs, should become their primary mode of decision-making. Consultation is a spiritual method for decision-making and is one of the fundamental Baha'i teachings. The reason why current politics are not helping humanity advance is that politicians are usually driven by vested interests and ideologies and are only concerned about their parties or their country's national interests. In addition, they have a very short time horizon, usually just to the next election. But our actions today will affect the climate for many hundreds, even thousands of years. It is also seen as a sign of strength not to change one's opinion. The method of consultation works in a very different way. Individuals participating in consultation have the common good in mind and are open to give up their personal points of view when others present facts or different perspectives that may be better. This requires the conquering of the ego and therefore spiritual development. But this is the only way to arrive at decisions that are really in the best interest of everyone. Moreover, this principle of consultation also includes that majority decisions are supported even by the minority who may have voted against it. This method of consultation requires a certain spiritual maturity, but it is very effective in finding good solutions and in bringing people together in unified action. This is sorely needed in our time when there is even conflict in environmental organizations that ultimately share the same goals. These were a few examples of how we can apply the Baha'i teachings to address climate change from the root. Of course, Baha'is, together with our friends, are still very much in the process of learning how to express these teachings in our personal and community lives, and how to apply them to the ills of the world. We are still at the very beginning of spiritual transformation. Yet, these teachings can provide us with a vision of a spiritual society worth sacrificing for. They provide an ethical framework and the motivation to work for harmony among ourselves and with nature. Next week will be our final conversation in this series. We will bring all the strands of the 4 previous topics together. We will discuss scientific projections for the future and reflect on the extraordinary situation humankind is currently in and what we can do to help it advance to a socially and environmentally responsible path. I thank all of you for listening and look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Christine. I was really very impressed because if someone wants to know, well, what do the Baha'is believe? This not only covers it, but it also covers it from the point of view of the application. And the reason why these teachings, which are, you've pretty much covered the basic social ethics, you might say, of the Baha'i Faith, plus some of the spiritual side as well, the teachings on prayer and personal transformation. But I think what you did is you provided a really marvelous example of how these teachings are relevant to our modern world. And that I think will make this talk really quite useful for really quite a long time. So I'm really impressed, and I thank you very much for that. Let me see what questions and comments we already have here. We have a Q&A box, and we also have a chat box. One person said, I love your presentation of the spiritual principles impacting climate change. It really centers us. I think that's a good way of putting it as well. I don't see anything yet in our Q&A box, but we'll see what else comes along.
I have a question to everyone who is there. How would you relate the Baha'i teachings on the fast to climate change? Or maybe you have some other idea, let's think of other Baha'i teachings that I was not able to cover in a short period of time.
Yeah, and something like the fast obviously is an attempt to contribute to our detachment, our moderation, our ability to control impulses. And so from that point of view, the fast itself is a vehicle for the spiritual change we've been talking about.
Right.
I think it's particularly valuable to talk about things like consultation, these principles of sort of spiritually mature discussion where people are trying to let go of their own ego, their own positions that they might hold, their own prejudices, and try to see things from the lens of the whole group so that everyone's ideas can be brought together, can complement each other, can reinforce each other, can correct each other, and lead to a new way of looking at a problem, a new way of finding solutions. And I think that's particularly useful. Phil asks a very interesting question. I am a new member to a local environment group. How best to divest politics from, he says, from reality, or at least from discussions, I suppose.
What do you mean, divest?
I think what he means is how do you keep politics out of the discussions in the local environment group?
Yeah, I've been in such situations too. It's not easy because people are very concerned. So I can I have much empathy for those, who take the political path. But it's not something that we want to be part of. So sometimes it helps to just open up the broader view, that we really need to work together and try to find common ground with those who think differently, those who are the obstacles, So instead of protesting or committing civil disobedience, I have one specific example in mind. Instead of being aggressive to someone who actually might be supportive of the environmental cause, but chose to do some, some actions that were not very good for the environment and for people, but in general would be very supportive. So instead of being aggressive, and we could seek conversation, and I think we would get further along, But then, of course, there is a place for people to protest and demonstrate and speak out, but we don't necessarily have to be involved too much with that because there are enough other people doing that. So
you can complement it with efforts to build unity.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, I think whenever I've encountered this kind of a situation that has been asked about, if I'm lucky, I'll think of a positive question to ask that person to help them think about the situation in a different way. Mm-hmm. Sometimes something like that will help. For example, on Facebook last week, someone posted a comment about how the governor of the state was giving $2.5 million of relief for illegal residents of the state. The person was furious. We should, get rid of this governor. They shouldn't be giving away our money and all this. But then it occurred to me afterwards, well, these are people who are paying sales taxes. They're paying income taxes. They're paying property taxes. If they're renting, their landlord is paying property taxes. They're doing essential services, various sorts, in the state. So whether they're there legally or not, their children frequently are residents. There's probably a principle of justice that needs to be considered before reacting so strongly to that particular small piece of facts, which of course are facts and which are true. So the difficulty is coming up with the right question to broaden out the discussion. Another person says, where did it go? David says, do you think mankind will catch up spiritually in time to avoid a mass die-off?
Well, there is someone out there who really strongly believes that humanity will not survive and propagates that, and I don't support that. Basically because of the promise of Baha'u'llah that this civilization will last for 500,000 years. But I think it's definitely unavoidable that there will be much suffering, much human suffering, and that many people will die. However, then you have to think, what is our life? We all die eventually. And the most important thing about life is that we spend it in a meaningful way. And the most meaningful way is to lessen people's suffering. So, whatever we can do. So we all certainly have a meaningful life until we die. And that's all we ask for. So we don't have to be depressed about the whole thing.
Phil, by the way, who had asked that question about being a member of the local environment group, says, thank you, I must find my own way.
Yes, absolutely. Everyone has to find their own way, yes.
Deborah said, you asked about the fast. Clearly, it trains us to be content with less, to be moderate in all things. So that's also a good
That's nice, yeah.
Example. And Deborah also said, you mentioned consultation. Baha'is are accustomed to using it to come to solutions, but do you have any strategies for introducing the Baha'i process of consultation in sometimes controversial situations outside the Baha'i community?
Well, the only time I did that in practice was before I was leaving the board of Rhode Island Interfaith Power&Light, and I wanted to make sure that the organization would continue to flourish. And so I brought building blocks, like children's toys, wooden blocks to the meeting. And I said I wanted to introduce a new way of decision-making that would preserve unity and assure effective action in the future. And so everyone received, they could all pick up some blocks. I can't remember, like everyone was able to pick up 5 blocks. And then they put down the blocks on the table. And I cannot remember what the task was, but they built a tower or a house or so. And then we talked about that, they were also allowed to move the other blocks. So there was some detachment. So it was like a practical game. And they all liked it. I don't think it helped, though, for the future after I left.
Oh, dear. Oh, dear. That's too bad. Here's a question. The largest and fastest growing religious group are the unaffiliated, many of whom are humanists. How are these to be integrated into this movement?
Well, I think humanists, they share the same values. So I think it's wonderful to collaborate with them. They are very constructive members of human society. And I know many in the climate movements and value them a great deal.
Good. I'm trying to see where this other question. It's unfortunately this. Well, maybe I can make the window bigger. Oh, that helps a lot. Now, of course, I can't see you, but Now I can at least see the question. Michael says, corruption and trustworthiness are problems in climate science, unfortunately, among different legitimate climate change scientists, potentially leading us in wrong directions. Integrity, not being biased, searching for the truth, seem key to coming up with workable solutions. It seems spiritual transformation needs to happen broadly to improve our climate situation. What do you think of that one?
I wonder about the beginning with corruption and trustworthiness are problems in climate science. I mean, there are certain, I don't know the English word. There are rules in science, like peer review, and that would basically rule out widespread corruption. And sometimes, there is corruption, but it's usually detected. And so it is more a problem that there are people who take climate science, they pick out certain things and then distort them because they just pick out, they cherry pick certain data and present them out of context to prove a certain point. That is corruption, right. And that's not science. And that's what the disinformation campaign about climate science is doing. They also shed doubt on climate scientists by attacking their personal lives and their trustworthiness. And so this is corruption. But in climate science, I don't think that there is much corruption. There's not more corruption than like in heart surgery science or, in botany, where the plants are coming, different plants, and it's about the same. Yeah.
Yeah, that's certainly my experience. As you know, I have a master's degree in planetary science from many moons ago. And I knew plenty of people who were doing climate science back in the late 70s, and they were all very good, solid researchers who were being trained properly to do professional work. And of course, if anybody, twists their data around, then they produce a result that's not reproducible.
Yeah.
Not reproducible, ultimately it will not stand. That's the important thing about, if you come to a conclusion and you publish it, of course it has to go through peer review and people check your method and they check your data frequently. If they don't find the data and the method to be sound, you can't publish the paper generally. And frequently they will find errors later on if other people try to duplicate it. Now, that's not to say that it's infallible, because obviously things slip through, and there's been all kinds of examples in the humanities, especially anyway, of people publishing papers that were largely nonsense. But actually, some people actually intentionally wrote some nonsense papers in one of the fields of humanities and managed to get it published. But of course, there you're not checking data. You don't have the scientific dimension. It's a much more poetic field, you might say. So, but certainly my experience also, like yours, has been quite solid. And in fact, your husband is involved, not in climate science, but he's involved.
He's a physicist.
Physicist, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But what's his name? Mr. Phelps, Dr. Phelps, was a Baha'i right down there at URI who was involved in the study of Narragansett Bay. And
Don, yes.
Don Phelps.
Yeah,
so,
he passed away a few years ago.
Yeah, I'm sure. So certainly we've met Baha'is in Rhode Island who were involved in this field as well. At any rate, let's see what other questions we have. This is another interesting question. I am seeing a lot of references to justice in resolving current issues. I appreciated how you expressed that justice is important and maybe the most important, but it also requires many other capacities to be able to create that justice. It was a very comprehensive and meaningful presentation. Thank you. Can you speak more about justice? That's a tricky question.
That is actually it's a really good question, because justice is really at the heart of climate ethics, you could say, and that's also what other religions like the Christian faith, Islam, Judaism. I work a lot in the interfaith community, and they really share two major concerns about climate change: climate justice and stewardship of the earth. That's what they concentrate on. That's all. That's all what they are focusing on. And that is good. It's right. And also the Pope in Laudato Si, he talks, that's an encyclical on climate change, but really half of the encyclical is about poverty and the injustice of the current system, that exploits people, and then about climate change. So this is really very important. I don't know what else I can say than that we just have to work for justice in our individual lives, but also as a society, and that this is really urgent. As we can see, fortunately, we can see this now more clearly, that we really have to get going in justice.
That's, I think, very true. And it's clear that justice becomes a central issue when you look at the oneness of humanity, when you look at the equality of men and women, you look at the distribution of resources around the world. All of these other issues all ultimately become justice issues.
Right. Because
they're all examples of unfair distribution and unfair treatment. Well, we've now gone a bit over an hour, and I don't see any other. Well, we have one more question that has just popped in. How can Baha'is be involved in climate awareness?
Oh, that is the best field for Baha'is to be involved in, I think. Because that's the most urgent, because the more people, and of course it's a process, everyone, awareness, it's not something you have from one moment to the next, and the awareness is growing. It's something that goes over time. And the more we can do with raising awareness everywhere, within the Baha'i community, within our local community, in our neighborhood, and then on the national and international level, that's the most important thing, because change only comes when people are really committed to change. And so we have to start with people's hearts. And next week, I'll talk more about that, actually. That will be a little bit the focus next week. But that's, and we can do that in many ways, by example, by our lifestyles. We can do it with educating our children. We can also suggest sustainable practices in Baha'i activities. We can write, we can speak out, we can write articles and send them to the newspapers. We can do a lot of things and talk with the families, and I think that's the most important area, definitely.
That's true. And we have now one more question which has popped in. With regard to the spiritual dimension of the solution to the problem of climate change, what role do you think that global prayer might play in affecting a change in the human attitudes towards climate change and impending practical solutions?
Well, prayer is always very good. Of course, we don't see the results of prayer in the material world. But prayer is very powerful. And then it has, in addition, the effect, as you are writing, it changes human attitudes. And then when you have a global prayer, you realize how you are united with people around the globe. And you all have the same intention. Mm-hmm. So it creates courage for action. So it's a very good thing to do. But of course, we cannot, limit ourselves to prayer.
Yeah.
Prayer, part of the prayer is always followed by action.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, and to some extent, a good way of ending our evening here together. We have, of course, another message here from someone who says, thank you very much, Christine. Very inspiring presentation. Another one says, thank you, Christine, on your wonderful presentation on climate change. Climate change is real, and thank you, Wilmette Institute. So that's, I think, a nice wrap up for this evening. Thank you again, Christine. We look forward to hearing your presentation next week on hope in spite of the dire scientific projections. And you already have given us a hint of the direction you're going to go. I think even tonight, in a way, was the hint to it as well. Mm-hmm. So
thank you very much, Robert, and thank you all for participating this evening.
Oh. And thank you, someone says, for inspiring action, which is, I think, another very good,
Great.
good comment from one of our participants tonight. So with that, I think we'll wrap up. Thank you again, Christine. We look forward to hearing you next week, and thank you, everybody, for joining us. Please join us again next Tuesday for number 5 of this 5-part series, and we will then have even more reason to hope, I'm sure. So thank you, everybody, and good night.
Thank you very much.